Hello, and a huge welcome to the Gina Gardiner and Friends show. And today I have Dr. Elizabeth Haywood, who's joining me. She is a non-executive director, and she is the author of an amazing novel called Lucy, which is about part of her family history. I've known Elizabeth for a while, and I know we're in for a great show. And we're going to be talking about women leaders in business. So Elizabeth, real big welcome to you. Thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you. And it's great to talk to you again, Gina.
So would you like to just share a bit of your story and particularly how you came to write Lucy?
Well, they come in two different packs, really. I sort of started out in business quite late because I left school and went to work as a secretary, and then decided later on that I wanted to do something a bit different. Heaven knows where the ambition came from, but it did. So I went back to university and then started out in managerial roles in business, and went from there, ending up as chief exec or director of the Welsh CBI, as communications director in the train operating companies, trade union, trade association, and eventually running my own executive search firm. So that's where I was, and I'm now doing non-exec work. And Lucy came from my family background, as you say. She was my great-great-great-grandmother, and she had an interesting and rather exciting life. She was a nice girl from a wealthy family who had a runaway marriage to a plantation owner from Barbados, who turned out not to be a very nice person when she went back to Barbados with him. And being quite a feisty woman, she ended up with a great many fights with him, and in the end left him. And she suffered a lot, saw slavery at first hand on the plantations, lost two of her children, and eventually managed actually to outlive the whole of her family. And she was helped back to Britain by two of the enslaved people on the plantation.
It's an amazing story, and I thoroughly enjoyed the novel. So I would very much suggest to anyone listening to this, it's a great novel to read. But I want to move on to the theme of women in business and business leaders particularly. And it's interesting because when we spoke before, there was a parallel between Lucy and leadership, because she certainly took the lead. But let's shift to business in the today and how the role that women are playing and the potential that they have to play a much bigger role. So what's your thoughts about women business leaders?
That there are too few of them is my main point. If you go back sort of 30 odd years ago, when I first started out as a manager in South Wales, in the county as it was then, South Glamorgan, there were no senior women managers, which seems absolutely amazing, but it was the case. Yeah. And that was changing even when I came in, but it was fairly shocking. And even now, if you look at the highest paid jobs in the UK, only 27% of those are held by women, so just over a quarter, and we're certainly at least half the population. And indeed, there are only 8 female chief executives currently in the FTSE 100, so the top 100 companies in the UK. It's a bit better in the US. The numbers there have gone up from only 7 in the S&P 500 20 years ago to 74 chief executives who are women now. So it is getting better, but we've got a long way to go, and it's a very glacial pace.
I'm interested because I've worked with many leaders, men, women and men, and I think that one of the challenges that there are for women, well, I think there's twofold. One is that in many cases, there is a glass ceiling, and because they are mothers or likely to be mothers, there is that perception that, you know, they can't take positions of leadership. But the other that I have discovered, which is absolutely as limiting as the former, is the belief of women that there is a glass ceiling, so they don't even attempt to get there. And I wonder what your view on that was.
Yes, I've sort of looked quite carefully at whether this is about nature or nurture and culture. And I really do not think it's about nature. If you look at how well girls do at school these days, they tend to outperform the boys. The same is true at university. This is a generalization, but if you look at the figures, and this is across the world, this is not just the UK or the US. So at university, they outperform the boys. At entry level in business, they tend to be on a par in terms of numbers. And immediately you get to the seniority levels, which tend to coincide with when the women might be going off to have children.
Yes.
The numbers go down. And so part of the problem, not all of it, but part of it, is about the fact that there are more, naturally, men at the top of business. They don't see the problems that women have unless they're really confronted with them as things that they need to try and do something about. If you have women at the top of a company, you are more likely, one, that they will actually bring in more women into senior levels of management, and two, that they will introduce policies, for example, around childcare and elder care, which will help those women return to the workplace. It's far, far better to retain your female workers, bring them back in, for example, after giving birth to a child, than having to go back out. It's very costly to go back out and recruit and retrain and hope that you are going to retain somebody else. And it's getting that message across, which I think is quite difficult. But most of that these days tends not to be deliberate discrimination. It is more likely subliminal. And also, this is the culture element, the way we were all brought up, women as well as men. And I'm quite happy to go into that in a bit more detail.
I think it's really interesting that we talk about culture, and I your view around how we're conditioned as we're brought up. Working with people as I do as a coach and mentor and trainer, I'm very, very aware that conditioning has such a strong hold on not only us as individuals, but collectively that way of being gets consistently reinforced.
Well, let me use an anecdote for you. A few years ago, it was about 3 or 4 years ago, Anne Robinson, who you'll probably know, but she's a strong feminist and journalist. She carried out an experiment in the UK with a class of 7-year-olds. It was a mixed group, girls and boys from all ethnic backgrounds. And she asked them to draw a mechanic, a surgeon, and a firefighter, and to give them names. There were 20 kids in the room, and she asked them to do this. And in the next room, she had their parents, and they were given the same task. And when they'd finished, she brought in a mechanic, a surgeon, and a firefighter, fully kitted out in headgear as well. And you should have seen the children's faces as they removed their headgear and they realized that they were all three women. And 17 of those 20 children had given their drawings male names, and every single one of the parents had. And what is even worse is that that experiment was carried out 30 years previously with exactly the same result.
That saddens me that I'm not surprised, I have to say, but it saddens me that in that 30 years, there had not been any change. And I think in a sense that really reflects that the differences that one sees are marginal. They're not at a core level that we see people as individuals and what that as an individual person can bring to the table, whatever their gender may be. And these days we've got multiple options in terms of the boxes you tick for gender. It ultimately, one would like to think it's going to be what value does that person bring to this role? I'd really like to explore with you, Elizabeth, what do you think are the solutions? How can we shift things, bearing in mind that there's been a lot going on, but we don't seem to have made the fundamental change in terms of the way in which children are conditioned? If the experiment you described before the break is to give us any sense of the reality.
I think that's true. I think there are a number of things. There is the conditioning. There's also legislation, which does help, but it's very slow in terms of its result. And I can certainly suggest a few practical tips for what should be done. Let me pick up on the legislation first of all. There has, as we know, been a lot of legislation around diversity, not just about gender diversity, but others as well. But I'm talking specifically about gender today. And quotas, although I don't like them, definitely do work. In the UK, we had Mervyn Davies, who came out with a report which was then made mandatory for the key companies in the UK. They had to have 25% of their board made up of women, so non-executive directors, by 2020, and they certainly achieved it. In fact, they reached a higher level than that. And that has now been cascaded down to the next set of companies, so down to the FTSE 350, so the top 350 companies. So that has helped. In Australia, for example, they changed their corporate governance rules in 2010, and that delivered a change from only 9% of women on boards then to 25% by 2016. So it can definitely help. The problem there for me is that, I mean, feminists from the 1970s are now saying that at that sort of pace, we're going to take another 100 years to get to parity, which is not good enough. And also, we are talking about non-executive directors, who are a very small band of people. We have to get the pipeline, the executive directors, to be women. But of course, to do that, you need very enlightened men, and you also need to get more women into the decision-making roles, so chief executive and chair. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So it's that kind of process. So legislation can help. It has a role to play. There is absolutely no doubt about it. It works, but we need a lot of other things as well. In terms of the conditioning, one of the things for me that I really haven't been able to get my head around is, if you go back to, and I am going back, so younger listeners won't really know about this, but in the 70s, when I was at school, we had a careers advisor, a woman careers advisor, and I was given 3 choices. You might well have had this one as well.
I'm smiling.
I bet you can guess what they were. Come on, you go ahead. What were they?
Secretary, nurse, shop assistant.
No, teacher.
Oh, teacher. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
So, which are all very important roles.
Yes.
But 1, there was never any suggestion of going to university. 2, there was nothing about manufacturing apprenticeships or going into business, or, I mean, I could go on. So I was being given very limited choices, as no doubt were you. And yet the feminists were, going around burning their bras and demanding equality, etc., etc. So it seems really crazy. And
can I just say to you on a personal note, when I applied to be a principal, a deputy head of a school, I went to have a look round beforehand, and the conversation went thus: there's no point in you applying for this job because I want a man. Oh, said I. Why do you need a man? Well, we need a man to run the football team. But this is the job of the deputy head. No, we need a man. So I applied anyway, and I was given an interview, got to the interview, and was told by the head, we're pleased to see you, but if there is a man who is your equal, doesn't need to be your better, if he's your equal, I'm just warning you that he'll get the job. Now, you could laugh about that in these days because it was so blatant. I was appointed, actually, and became the head of the school a year later. But you have to smile at, we think that we've come a long way. I think so much of it has just gone underground rather than it being so blatant.
I think you're right, but I also think there is some blatant stuff still going on. I mean, just an example, do you remember Carly Fiorina from Hewlett Packard?
Yes.
Who was a very feisty lady, and she fought her way to the top, quite unusual. But when she first started out with Hewlett Packard in a senior role, she was introduced by her boss to a key client as, meet Carly, she's our token bimbo.
Oh, My
That was in
goodness.
1982. I mean, it'd be completely illegal now, but for heaven's sakes. And what does that do to customer confidence? So that's one thing. But if you look at the reports that are done every year now in terms of how boards are beginning to develop the number of women on them, it's quite terrifying. Some of the comments that you get. We've got one already. All the good ones have already gone. And I remember when I first started out applying for board positions, I was told, well, it probably wouldn't be possible because we don't have any women's toilets on the board. I mean, it is so blatant, but why do they think it's acceptable, I suppose, is the argument. And I think there you are going to get, certainly at board level, I think investor encouragement, shall I say, as they're doing already with, for example, green policies and carbon neutrality, they are beginning to ask questions about diversity within companies. And this is really key in terms of business, that is part of the commercial argument that business directors, male business directors, will sit up and understand. If somebody's saying to them, well, no, we're not going to invest in you because your diversity is absolutely shot to pieces, it's rubbish, they'll sit up and take notice and do something about it. So that is one of the things that we need to be doing, is actually making the arguments, as Mervyn Davies did when he came up with his report, on commercial grounds, that actually it isn't that women have smaller brains, as used to be said, or that we're less productive, as is still sometimes said. Indeed, a Citicorp chief executive has said it's likely to raise your productivity in a company by 6%. And McKinsey say the same thing. More diverse boards have a better shareholder return. And this year they've said it was 53% better. That is not to be sneezed at.
It certainly isn't. We're going to have to go for a short break, but when we come back, what I'd like to explore with you in the few minutes that we have left in this interview is, what is it that women bring to the table that is perhaps different, or whether we look at masculine and feminine energy, which of course both genders can have. Elizabeth, why do you think it's important that women are encouraged and become business women leaders? What is it they bring to the table?
I think they bring an awful lot. One of the things that they bring is the fact that they bring a different perspective from men in terms of consumers. Now, the company has customers. It really does need to listen to all of those customers and the potential customers, or it's likely to lose out on a large portion of its sales.
Yes.
So that's very important. I think they have a different way of looking at the strategy of the company. Again, this is a generalization. It doesn't happen with all women, but in terms of a more holistic approach, possibly a slightly longer term approach than many men.
Yes.
They tend to be incredibly resilient because they've had to fight very hard to get where they're going. So if they fall over, they dust themselves off and pick themselves up. I think on the negative side, they tend sometimes to be put on much too high a pedestal and be expected to fall. And when they do fall, there's a lot of "it's told you so," there's no point in having them. So that can be quite negative. I think they have a different kind of language. And interestingly, I was speaking to an MBA group the other day, which is mixed men and women, and the men agreed with this, that we did have a different way of looking at problems and discussing them, the different language we used, and that can actually be very helpful both in problem solving and in gaining trust and confidence from people. So I think all of those things are really important. They do often have a different way of dealing with people. There is more empathy or more focus on empathy than there often is with men who are more focused on we've got to get this done, this is the delivery target. As I say, all of that is generalizations. I don't want to put everybody into the same box.
No.
That's what we have to look at.
And one of the things that I find very challenging is, and I've worked with a wide range of women in leadership, is that sometimes they think that they've just got to behave like less hairy men in order to be successful.
That was certainly what we used to think in the 70s and 80s. So yeah.
And I think that legacy still exists for some, when the reality is that, using our attributes as women. You've talked about empathy, you've talked about the capacity for creating lasting and meaningful relationships. And I think men are as capable of doing it, but there is a tendency that women are more aware of that and perhaps spend more time in creating and engaging and maintaining those relationships. And again, we are talking in gross generalizations. But ultimately, it just seems to me that the businesses that use the attributes and the skills of both are going to be stronger. It's not an either or.
No, I think that's true. But I also think that women can sometimes be their own worst enemies.
I would agree.
And in terms of sort of practical suggestions as to what we can actually do without waiting for the legislation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I think I'd make 4. One is that we should, all of us, take one or more women under our wing, and you've got lots of experience in this, and mentor them.
Yes.
It can be on an informal basis.
Just, I don't want to detract from that, but one of the things that really strikes me is how often women are unsupportive of one another.
Yeah.
And I think that's just got to stop. If somebody else is successful, it doesn't diminish your success. Exactly. Ultimately, be pleased for them and support them. But anyway, do carry on, because I am very conscious of time.
That's okay. I think I totally agree with you on that. I'm hoping it's improving, but I don't know. One of the key points that came out earlier this year is that women tend to get dragged into doing all sorts of non-productive things, like making a coffee or agreeing to arrange the office party. And that actually, if you add all of that up, it comes to about a month of unproductive activity a year. So that's a month less productive in terms of if you're looking for promotion, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to get much, much better at saying no, which we're actually very bad at. I think all women are
back
bad.
to conditioning. I think you've got to be a good little girl and do as you're told.
Yeah, no. So you just say, terribly sorry, not part of my job description, I'm not doing it. Do avoid buying your daughters toys in pink packaging. Did you know that 89% of girls' toys are in pink packaging?
Yes.
Hardly any of them are related to science and technology. It's dreadful. Instead, buy them Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, which is an absolutely brilliant book. And fourthly, if you're in a position to influence succession planning, so this is really for the senior people there, chairs and chief execs, etc., please do so. Work with the HR team, see how you can actually maybe change the language in job adverts, etc., and look favourably on women who do come for interviews. They don't want to have the sorts of problems you did when you went as deputy head.
No. I'd like to add to that, women, if you're listening to this, just recognise your own worth. Men, generally speaking, are much better at selling themselves.
Oh, yes.
Where women tend to downplay their achievements. And I think, own it without ego. This is not about boasting, but just own who you are. And, so many women suffer from imposter syndrome, that they're doing a great job, and the evidence is that they're doing a great job, but they will minimize what they're doing in case other people think that it's not good enough. And
there's a hoary old chestnut from my recruitment days, which is actually sadly still true. And that is, if you put a job advert in front of a man and a woman, the man will say, yeah, can do this, can't do that, can do this, can't do that, can do this, oh, definitely I'll apply. The woman will look at it and say, can do this, can't do that, do this. Oh, I'm not going to apply for something I can't do. And that attitude just encapsulates exactly what you've just said, Gina. So.
Yeah. We've sadly come to the end of the show. Please email me at Gina, Gina, at genuinely-you. Elizabeth, where can people get hold of you?
My email address is probably the easiest one, which is Elizabeth at Haywood Hain, or one word, which is HAYWOODHAIN.com.
Thank you very much. And again, my email, gina@genuinely-u.com.
Can I add just one more tiny point? How are we going to know when we've truly cracked the glass ceiling? And my yardstick is that the day we have as many mediocre women in top jobs as we currently have mediocre men, will have made it.
That seems to be like a great measure. Thank you very much. So just to say goodbye, take care and see you on the next show. Bye bye now.
Thank you, Gina.